Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'll be taking a look at the state of Michigan, and I'll be giving you all an in-depth analysis on this state, how I think it's going to go, and what's important to watch here. So a couple days ago, I did a similar video for Wisconsin, and I've done other videos, right, for North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, the usual suspects, right? Today I'll be doing Michigan, and I'll be talking about the presidential race here. I might do a Senate race video before the election, but we only have 2 weeks, so time's always a factor in these videos, and how much I can put out. But with that being said, I want to get into this because I think Michigan's a really interesting state, and I actually disagree with a lot of the conversations that's been being had about this, the results here and what's likely to happen in 2 weeks. So I see Michigan. I'll be very clear about my position in this video, and I'll kind of defend it today, right? I think Michigan is leaning towards Kamala Harris. Now, the movement in the polls and the movement in the consensus by proxy has been that Michigan is essentially a toss-up, that both candidates have an equal chance of winning it. Maybe a slight edge to Harris, but nothing more than like a very small edge. I disagree with that. Trump can definitely win Michigan. I think he has like a 1 in 3 chance, certainly, which 1 in 3 is a good chance, by the way, right? Like a 1 in 3 chance is very, very respectable. Nothing to sneeze at, but it's not 50% either. And I believe that for a couple of reasons. The first reason I want to get into for why I think Trump's a bit overvalued in Michigan and why, again, a reason to believe Harris is going to win here is just party structure and the ground game and the competency of the parties in this state. Now, usually, I actually don't love looking at like anecdotal data and being like, oh, well, my friend was a canvasser in I don't know, Alcona County, Michigan, and he met 2 people who voted for Trump last time. We're going to vote for Harris this time. I don't like any of that type of analysis because it's usually anecdotal and it isn't better than statistical analysis. What I do think is important, though, is looking at the party structure in this state. And I know that in 2023, the Michigan Republican Party almost went bankrupt. The Michigan Democrats, on the other hand, have not lost a statewide race here in 8 years. It was when Trump was on the ballot in 2016 was the last time Republicans won a statewide race in Michigan. So Democrats been on a winning streak here. They have a lot more money to actually, to fund get out the vote operations as they've been doing, right? Than their Republican counterparts. And on top of that, what I think is really interesting is the Michigan Democrats have really, really been effective at outperforming in the past 3 cycles. In 2018, I think they outperformed. I think in 2020, they did about as expected. I think 2020 was their least impressive year, maybe. And then in 2022 was their best year because they won the 3 competitive House seats and came close. They came within a point of winning a seat that was, expected to be Republican by a couple of points. And obviously, Gretchen Whitmer and Dana Nessel and I'm forgetting the Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. My apologies. But the 3 big races, governor, Secretary of State, and Attorney General, all went blue by considerable amounts. So Democrats been on a winning streak here, and Republicans have given us no reason to trust them, right? Now, the good news for the Republicans is that when Trump's on the ballot, things are competitive. In 2020, the Michigan Democrats, I think, were still the superior party in the state. But Trump being on the ballot made it very close. And as you can see on your screen, it was a 3-point race. It wasn't like Joe Biden blew Donald Trump out of the water here. And he could have, because in the polls, he was up by 6 points on election day, and he won by less than half of that. So Trump did pretty well here, all things considered, in 2020. But to go back to the party structure, just to make my last point on this, right? I think the gap between Michigan Democrats and Michigan Republicans has only increased, obviously to the benefit of the Democrats, since 2020. And Michigan Republicans have had a really rough past 2 years. And that's, I think, part of this that's going to really hurt them, right? If we see lower turnout than expected in some of those rural Republican areas, I think part of that can be blamed on the Michigan GOP. Now, Trump's going to get those voters out. He's going to really create a pretty high floor, I'd say. There's a cap to how poorly the Republicans can do here, especially in rural areas where Trump is really, really popular. But keep that in mind. And in close swing states like this, that matters. But let's talk about the polling now, because I think the polling is what's really driving a lot of the shift in narrative here. So what you'll see is that Harris actually led by 3 points for a good chunk of time here, right? And as we got into even the end of September, it was a pretty similar thing. And what we've seen is that the gap has closed pretty rapidly just in the past month, and it's now a dead heat. And Harris has actually gone from, almost at 49%. She's now down to 47.5. So Harris has not had a good month of October in the polls in Michigan. But this is, I think, a product of a few things. The first thing we have to recognize is that objectively, the polling, the pool of polls that we have, if you will, is Republican leaning, because Democratic groups, right, like PPP or I don't know, Data for Progress, right? Democratic groups have not really released polls to the extent that they used to. Republican groups are just unloading poll. I mean, like, Trafalgar, Rasmussen, Insider Advantage, Fabrizio. Let's see what else we have here. On Message, right? Trafalgar again. It's almost like 20 to more than that. Like a third of the polling we have is just from Republican pollsters. And that's obviously going to skew the averages. And in 2022, the same thing happened. We had Republican pollsters, coming into the averages, and Democrats said they were flooding the averages. I don't think it's maybe a tactical thing, because I don't think there's really any incentive for that. But yeah, the averages are skewed by Republican pollsters. And if you took out the pollsters that were Republican leaning in the competitive 2022 Senate races, you'd have seen the polling was a lot more accurate than the averages had it looking. Because when Trafalgar came in and said that, I don't know, Dr. Oz is up by 3 points in Pennsylvania, that skewed the average, right? That moved it towards Republicans more so than it really should have. And now in 2022, the counter argument to this was that, if Democratic organizations have, like, the reason that Republican organizations are releasing their polls is because they have good results. Democrats in their polls are finding the same thing. They're just not releasing them because they don't want to release them to candidates being down. But in 2022, whether or not that was true is irrelevant, because Democrats clearly won those races and they didn't release any polling that had them up. And the same thing in 2024 could be happening. But aside from like the whole flooding the zone thing that I think is real to an extent, the high quality pollsters do show decent results for Harris. WAPO had her up by 2 in their likely voter undecided push. If we take a look at some of these other polls that are, I think, okay, like MRG had her up by 1. Emerson had her tied, which is a concern. But she was up in Fabrizio and Lee in their nonpartisan Wall Street Journal Commission poll. She was up by 2. Quinnipiac had her down, which I think is the worst poll of the cycle for her in Michigan, at least. But she was up in Glengrove, which is a very good local pollster. And she was up even in a Republican poll at the beginning of the month. And so what we see, and by the way, in New York Times Siena, we actually saw, let's see, their likely voter undecided push, she was up by 1. So, the high-quality pollsters favor her here. And when you take out your Trafalgars and your, what else do we have, right? Your radical politics is, which actually, they had Harris up by 1, so I can't hate on them. You can't say too much for that. And again, you have a Fabrizio poll commissioned by Trump, right? Take out some of those polls, and it looks a bit better for Harris, right? But, the movement is still clear. Trump is still doing better here than he was a few months ago. But again, another part of that is that polls have changed, right? Like, if you look at the polling in 2022 was fundamentally different from 2020 because the methodology was different. In 2022, what we had was pollsters in 2020, what we had was pollsters would call people. And often we had a lot of Trump voters who said, I'm voting for Trump. And then they'd hang up. They wouldn't want to answer the other 75 questions, understandably, right? And pollsters used to delete those responses. They just say, okay, we're not going to count that. And then in 2022, that changed. They started counting those voters. And, that pretty clearly was part of why the polls were, missed in the other direction in 2022. They underestimated Democrats instead of Republicans. And in 2024, the same thing could be happening. Now, again, I don't like to predict the polling miss because it's kind of pseudoscientific, and I'm not going to, the worst type of analysis you can do as an election forecaster is say, hey, look, well, in 2020, the polls underestimated Biden by this much in this state. So that means that if we just apply this swing to the Harris margin, we're going to get our result. No, that's not what's going to happen, right? That has never been an accurate way to predict elections. What we do know, though, is that we can talk about the polls and see what they're showing. We can talk about if they pass the smell test. We can talk about what is likely driving those results. And I think the polls right now could be better for Harris, certainly, but they're not bad enough to make me think she's going to lose Michigan. And the real reason I think she's going to win, on top of the polls and the party organization stuff, is that when you do the math, when you look at the geography, it's hard to see Michigan going red. Trump lost the state by 150,000 votes in 2020, a little more than that, right? Which is close, right? It's a 3% margin statewide. But it wasn't like Wisconsin, where he was a couple counties away from winning the state. It wasn't like Georgia. It wasn't like Arizona. It wasn't that close, really. And so the argument for Trump here, just from a mass standpoint, is that 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the primary, right? And obviously not all 100,000 of them are going to come out and vote for Trump. In fact, I don't think the majority will. But a good enough chunk of them are going to stay home, and maybe they voted for Biden in 2020. And that's going to really hurt Trump here. But that number is really not that impressive. Because first of all, let's say all 100,000 of those voters came out and vote for Trump, which will never in a million years happen. But let's just say that happened, right? He's still down by 55,000 votes statewide, right? And even then, these voters, these are registered Democrats. They're voting in the Democratic primary. And they voted against Biden. They didn't vote against Kamala Harris. They voted against Joe Biden, right? I think a lot of those voters, I think the media portrayed that vote as like the proxy for pro-Palestine Democrats in Michigan who wanted to express that Biden was not being harsh enough on Israel, right? Who wanted to get that foreign policy grievance out, right? All of that. But I think a lot of that genuinely came from this idea that Biden was too old and that he wasn't popular, because Biden was not popular even when he ran in 2024, even before the debate. And so what we saw was a lot of people came out and voted uncommitted in the primary. I bet that if you ran that primary back with Kamala Harris, the number of people who voted uncommitted would be a lot fewer, maybe even only 50,000 instead of 100,000. But even then, right, 100,000 uncommitted voters, it was expected to be maybe 130,000 or 150,000. In the end, the uncommitted vote, I think, kind of disappointed a lot of people who wanted to see it happen, because as a percentage, I remember it was a lot less than some of the polling had and a lot less than some of the people on the media were expecting. And so that factor to me isn't really a compelling reason to give Trump the win here. And another factor that I think kind of comes from a similar argument that doesn't really make a lot of sense is that Arab voters are going to swing Michigan to Trump because, well, obviously, we've seen some polling that is some micro-targeted polling that has showed that Arab voters may be leaning towards Jill Stein or are leaning towards voting against Trump or Harris because of anger with the war in Gaza, right? And I fully believe we're going to see a pretty significant shift against the Democrats with Arab voters, especially in areas like Dearborn, because in 2022 we even saw this, right? What I don't think is that it's going to be big enough to swing the state, because let's say you had a 25 or even 30-point swing with people who identify as Arab Michigan who voted. That would be like maybe half a point statewide. So you need a massive swing to even make up a point, and Trump lost the state by almost 3 points in 2020. So both those things, the 100,000 number and, the 25, 30-point swings with Arab voters, both those numbers seem pretty compelling at first glance. When you do the math, it's not that much. But it doesn't end there for me, right? Let's also talk about the suburbs, because the suburbs are what I really think is going to give the win to Kamala Harris. In 2022, we saw Democrats do well in working class and rural areas, which I don't think Harris will be able to do, at least to the extent that Gretchen Whitmer did, right? Trump will win Macomb County. It's right here. It's outside of Detroit. It's an 8-point, he won it by 8 points in 2020. It's pretty red these days. Gretchen Whitmer won it by a couple points in 2022, but that's a down ballot race. Harris will not win Macomb County. Harris is not going to do very well in the rural areas. Trump can get to 47% in Michigan easily. He can get to, at the absolute worst, he'll get to 46.5. Absolute worst. So Harris is not matching or coming close to matching the Gretchen Whitmer, rural or working class performance. What she should be looking for, and what she is looking for, is the suburbs. When you look at this campaign, you ask yourself how it's been run. It's been run through the suburbs. It's been, look at who she's touting as her endorsements. Look at the messaging she's using. It isn't, obviously I think Harris has messaged about a lot of things. It depends where she is. But a lot of it is about abortion. It's about the 2020 election and Donald Trump's response to it. It's about extremism, right? The Democrats, and I truly believe this, if Kamala Harris wins this election, or at least is better than people expect her to do, it'll be because she successfully convinced enough people that the Republicans are too extreme. And that has been working for Democrats. It worked for them in 2022, and it I think has worked for them in local elections in 2023, which is why they did really well in a bunch of Supreme Court races across Wisconsin and Pennsylvania last year. And the abortion issue obviously helps that really well for Democrats. But in Michigan this year, what it's going to be is Harris is, and she's doing this already. It's going to be targeted messaging for the suburbs. It's targeted messaging for, moderate voters outside of Detroit, outside of Grand Rapids, maybe in Kalamazoo, right? Michigan, a lot of big suburban counties, a lot of medium-sized affluent towns that moved towards Joe Biden by a lot in 2020. And if we take a look at how Trump did in these counties, it was bad. Oakland County outside of Detroit, he did 6 points worse. He did 7 points worse in Livingston, which is Republican leaning, but it's, trending left and more suburban. Kent County, Grand Rapids, Biden flipped this county. He won it by, 6 points. He did 9 points better than Hillary Clinton. Look at Ottawa County, another 9-point swing. Obviously, it stayed red because it's kind of more exurban. Biden did 9 points better there. That matters. That really matters. So you have a lot of suburbs across the state, and they account for way more of the population than just 100,000 voters, who voted uncommitted, or a 25, 30-point swing with Arab voters in the state. That's what it comes down to, is the suburbs. Trump can do better here, right? His path in Michigan is obviously hoping that the turnout is lower in these areas and that Detroit, is also lower in turnout. But so far, I don't think that's going to be true, right? Because of the early voting has been solid for Democrats thus far, although too late to draw conclusions, but I digress, right? The Trump path is to obviously match his 2020, maybe do a little better in rural and working class areas, and then see a drop in Detroit and accompany that with holding even in the suburbs. But that's hard for him to do because it relies on so many different things to happen at the same time, and he's already in a deficit the shape of 150,000 votes. Harris, all she needs to do, even if she loses a little bit in the rural areas, even if she loses a little bit in the working class areas, and maybe in Detroit, she just gains 2 points back in the suburbs. It's game over. Doesn't matter. That's easy to do. She doesn't need to get the same swing in Grand Rapids or in Oakland that Biden got. She can get half of that, and she wins the state. And that's why. That's why I think it's easier to see a Harris win here. That's simply what it is. Trump can win here, but it's easier for Harris because all she has to do is just do and by the way, she can do it in many ways. She can do it by having Detroit increase as a proportion of the statewide electorate. She can do it by cutting into Trump's rural margins. But the easiest path for her, the most likely path for her based on what happened in 2020 and 2022, is getting that suburban vote out and blue. And that's what matters for her. So Trump is the path here, but I don't think he's favored, and I don't think it's a toss-up either. I think Michigan is in the lean Democratic column. The polls are close, but I'm willing to kind of buck them a little bit and say, hey, look, Harris to me is still a 2-3 point favorite. I think she'll win it by a similar amount Biden did in 2020 at the end of the day. Let me know what you all think. Let me know what you're expecting to see, and I'll see you all in the next one.